Hi, Ronen. So welcome back to our conversation about critical realism. Last time we suggested that the secular debates about critical realism of the late 20th and early 21st century were anticipated by Catholic scholars in the mid-20th century, including Etienne Gilson and Bernard Lonergan. All of the relevant philosophical issues were discussed in that debate about 20th century neo-scholasticism. That is to say, the 20th century revival of the ideas of St. Thomas Aquinas.
Mm-hmm. So the API is very interested in Canadian philosophy, and we have a particular interest in the intellectual scene in Toronto circa 1950s, 1960s. And that scene is exemplified by such figures as Marshall McLuhan, remember, the medium is the message, and also by Etienne Gilson, who was originally from France and was a founder and later director of the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies at St. Michael's College. We're also very interested in Bernard Lonergan, who was also from Toronto. He was originally from Buckingham, Quebec, but eventually he was a professor at Regis College. So the two major works of these scholars were largely written in Toronto, which to us is very, very important.
Yeah. Thanks, Ronan. So on to our discussion.
Absolutely.
So Gilson's first book on the subject was Methodical Realism, a handbook for beginning realists. And in that book, Gilson attacked the views of two critical realists of the Louvain school, Cardinal Mercier and Monsignor Noel, who were not known today, but were well known in their own day amongst neo-scholastics. And Gilson argued that realism was incompatible with the critical method, and that realism per se, same thing as Mendoza's realism per totum viam, is its own method. And so Gilson's argument was that to the extent that Mercier and Noel accommodated the critique of knowledge in their own thought, it could not be considered realism, still less realism Thomist right. Realism. Right. And he would further suggest that the critique of knowledge is idealist in method. We've kind of made that point before, starting with thought, in short, and that this problem goes all the way back to Descartes. And according to Gilson, Descartes was in intention a realist, but an idealist in method. Going back to what you were saying about Kant earlier, maybe it would be reasonable to make that same point about Kant, that he intended to be a realist, but in the event or in practice conceded too much to realism. One thought that I had about that was, of course, that Kant did not call his theory critical realism. He called it critical idealism, which...
But he also called it the critique of pure reason, or at least that one has to critique reason also. Yes.
Fair enough. But I mean, do you think that? Did you think that he was that he conceded too much to idealism? Put it that way.
Okay, so you mentioned Descartes, and you mentioned Kant. I think that this notion that Descartes was an idealist, but his intention was realism.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting idea. Now, I would say that idealists basically argue that ideas are very important. That a lot of knowledge comes from within, right? So we know some things independent of experience. Certainly Kant argued that we have the categories of understanding, and those categories of understanding are independent of experience, but they inform experience. Now, what I would say is that both Kant and Descartes didn't argue against reality. They didn't argue against there being a world out there that is knowable. I think what they said was that there is a way in which the mind interacts with experience to bring about knowledge. And I would concede that for both Kant and Descartes, the internal reality was very, very important. Whether it was more important than experience, I'm not sure. Maybe for Descartes, it was definitely more, I would say, important than experience. But for Kant, I'm not sure it was. Experience and the categories of understanding were kind of on an equal ground. But I would generally agree that there is definitely a realist intent in both Kant and Descartes, which is the point I think you were making.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I see where you're coming from, in particular this idea that they're on the same level kind of thing, right? But so I definitely see where you're coming from. But I think that Gilson would say that this does not work because we cannot proceed from thought to things. That's another quote from him.
Right.
Because there is no bridge between them. Like, even if they're on the same level, how do we get backwards and forwards from one to the other?
Okay. Yeah.
And this is precisely the problem of the bridge, as it's literally so called in the literature.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure about there being no way to bridge them. I think that Kant would argue that it's not about making a bridge. It's the mind and whatever is out there interacting dynamically. And it's not that one has to consciously make a bridge to what is external to us. It is a dynamic process that happens without us being consciously aware of it. So, I mean, for Kant, we are not consciously aware of the categories of understanding. Okay, they are there, and they interact with the noumena to bring about knowledge or the experience that we have that we can know. But it's not an actual bridge building. That maybe I think bridge building is more applicable to Descartes than it is to Kant.
It could well be. Remember Gilson himself was originally a Descartes scholar. Right. So anyway, I mean, I suppose the idea, going back to Gilson's argument, and come to Lonergan again in a moment, is that fundamentally idealism postulates the so-called primacy of consciousness. Going back from Kant's level, the consciousness is definitely primary, rather than the primacy of existence or being. Right. So thought comes first. In term, but someone like Gilson, I would say that to a realist, and you and I have used this slogan before, putting the matter in Cartesian terms is not so much a question of I think, therefore I am.
Right.
But I am, therefore I think. In other words, before you think, you have to exist.
Right. Okay. I hear it.
Yeah. So anyway, one criticism made of Gilson's methodical realism was exactly the criticism we just made of him, that the views of only a few critical realists were discussed, just two, de Mercier and Noel. And then in his second book, Thomist Realism and the Critique of Knowledge, therefore did go on to discuss the work of some more contemporaries and return to the charge. But this is the point that we were coming to earlier. He did argue that that was not really necessary, because what is at stake are fundamental philosophical principles and not the formulation of particular authors, be they Descartes, be they Kant, be they Lonergan. So therefore he would say, there was no need to repeat the exercise at each time a new act. We talked about this before. Let's just sort of look at it slightly different. You said earlier that you think each new writer does provide some kind of nuance. But does that mean, like, every time someone writes a new book, we have to go through it and go through the details and once the fundamentals have been worked out?
Well, I kind of agree with what you say, but I don't completely agree with what you say. I think it depends on the book and what is being said. There is definitely, in my opinion, something to be said for reevaluating one's position. And there are a number of crucial, in my opinion, reasons for this. Number one, philosophical ideas evolve. So new iterations can bring fresh insights, and there are refinements to one's thinking. So it's very important to consider that. Number two, diversity of voices, right? So reevaluating ensures a diversity of perspectives, and perspectives do change. The way we actually think about a fundamental idea in philosophy can change over time. Ideas also can adapt to contemporary issues. So, for example, something that may not have worked 100 years ago actually can all of a sudden be rediscovered and can work. And so it doesn't make sense to just say, that doesn't work. We're just not going to talk about it anymore. There's also refinements that happen over time. And of course, philosophy itself is dynamic. And just the nature of philosophy is such that it makes sense to regularly reevaluate ideas in philosophy. When talking specifically about critical realism, I do think it's important to reevaluate the different versions of critical realism that different philosophers bring to the table. For example, Lonergan's critical realism is not the same as Immanuel Kant's critical realism.
Yeah, or critical idealism.
Or critical idealism. Let's just not confuse things.
No,
it's
fair enough,
critical realism.
There's mischievous of me.
Very mischievous. Lonergan's version, Bernard Lonergan's version of critical realism is not the same.
Bernard.
Or Bernard. Okay, sorry about that. Bernard.
That's my choice.
That's your thing. But they're not the same. They're not the same, John. And to say, well, we've already put aside Kant's version of critical realism, therefore we're not even going to bother looking at Lonergan's version because we've already done it.
Okay, I do take your point, but here's the thing, right? Lonergan's insight is a massive volume of 875 pages.
Okay.
Right.
It's a hard read.
Yeah, and it's not easy to read.
No.
Fortunately, an Australian scholar by the name of Peter Beer has published a very readable introduction to Lonergan, which I recommend everyone to read. What is most interesting is how Beer characterizes Lonergan's achievements, and in order, Lonergan is said to have made contributions in cognitional theory, number 1, epistemology, number 2, and finally 3, metaphysics. Mm-hmm. And so, distilling down that 875 pages, maybe this is the key to the Gilson-Lonergan impasse. Because whatever the value of Lonergan's contribution to the special science of, quote, cognitional theory, and I think the consensus here is highly positive. Like, I've never met anyone that, seriously criticizes the cognitional theory.
Right.
From the philosophical point of view, that sequence seems to be the wrong way around. It violates what we call the philosophical order last week. The idea that metaphysics must come first, specifically the fundamental choice between realism and idealism, which we've been dancing around, all day.
Yeah.
The appropriate epistemology follows from that. And then the epistemology may be applied to the particular special science, whatever that is, right? Mm-hmm. So, Ronen, does this then validate the attention that we paid earlier to that idea of the philosophical order?
Okay. So, I need to say something about the fixed philosophical order.
Yeah.
So, look, we can definitely talk about that. And I think there is some kind of a philosophical order, but I think that one has to be flexible about it. Here's the problem, John. You're assuming that there's a universally agreed upon sequence in philosophy.
Well, it's not agreed upon. And what's being suggested is that there should be.
Okay, yeah. It doesn't matter. Should be. Yeah. It doesn't matter. You're basically asserting that metaphysics must precede epistemology. But I think that there's a variation in philosophical methodologies and priorities amongst thinkers. Also, you say that epistemology should follow metaphysics. But again, I think the reality is more complex. Often epistemology and metaphysics work as a kind of dynamic relationship. It's not that one follows the other. They work together, and questions do arise with regards to the metaphysics. Questions arise with regards to the epistemology. There are varying relationships between these branches, and different people think of them in different ways. So I'm not sure about the hierarchical layers that you're putting there.
This is going to come up again next time. When we go.
That's
back,
true.
Which will be interesting.
Yeah.
So I'd just like to just go back to Lonergan per se. A very interesting device that was used by Beer to explain Lonergan's theory was to discuss the murder mystery, the film Dial M for Murder, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. Should do that in your philosophy and film series.
Sure.
That's a good idea. Anyway, in that film, Chief Inspector Hubbard of Scotland Yard, this is the way these things begin, is called in to investigate the case of a woman who was killed an intruder to her apartment, apparently in self-defense. Then it seems that the intruder was a blackmailer with information about the woman's activities. Maybe she murdered him to cover these things up. Finally, it is revealed, perhaps needless to say, that the whole thing was planned by the woman's husband, who's planted evidence and so on, so that she would be wrongly convicted and actually executed in those days. Anyway, Hubbard has to sort all this stuff out. There is evidence, but it's all false or fake, and he has to dig through it, and very importantly, ultimately, has himself to be convinced that it is the truth. Never mind the jury and the trial or whatever. If he's doing his job, he himself has to be convinced that he knows the truth. Anyway, this is obviously a far from accurate description of any real world police procedure,
right?
But it's an excellent description of Lonergan's theory, good illustration of Lonergan's theory. And interestingly, Lonergan also mentions detective stories in the very preface to his long book. And Lonergan says, that in the ideal detective story, the reader is given all the clues but fails to spot the criminal.
Right.
But your fictional detective solves the mystery by what Lonergan calls a supervening act of understanding. And this is what Lonergan means by insight, and then sets out to explain in the remaining 875 pages. This is on the first page. In the remaining 875 pages of the book.
Yeah.
The key question for me, actually, is this. Is exactly how does this insight come about?
Right.
Is it just by reason and you finally come up to it? Or is there any role for what Kant would call the transcendentals and what everyone would call the transcendentals?
Right.
So here's the thing. If the philosophical order is maintained, presumably there would not need to be. Yes, there would still be insight. Yes, there would still be this. You still would solve the mystery. But there wouldn't need to be, bolts from the blue kind of thing, explaining it. The metaphysics would already be established, and it would not be necessary to try to derive the metaphysics from the practical situation. So what do you say to that?
Look, I do believe that metaphysics, knowing your metaphysics is very important. I have no quarrel with what you're saying there. But I do think that the notion of insight, as described by Lonergan, is an interesting one. And from my limited understanding of Lonergan, there's nothing transcendental in the insight that he's referring to. I think that for him, there's a kind of dynamic cognitional process that's going on. So the mind, like with Kant, is involved in understanding patterns and the significance of patterns. And insight is when those patterns are sort of put together into something that one can say is knowledge. And that insight is something that happens potentially in an instant. And it's a kind of sudden intellectual breakthrough. And I think it's something that's reasonable, because I've seen it happen. Now, one has to say, and I'm going to say it quickly because we've gone for a long time now, but there's a significant difference between the Kantian notion of categories of understanding and Lonergan's notion of a dynamic cognitive sort of operation. Because one of the things that Lonergan argues is that we ourselves gain awareness of our own structures and operations. So unlike with Kant, where the categories of understanding are universal, but we're not aware of them, there's a dynamic in Lonergan where we become aware of what the mind is doing, and being self-aware in that way is actually key to true knowledge. And true knowledge actually transcends just empirical knowledge, right? It's also knowledge about the self and the mind and all sorts of other things. So yeah, I think that the detective story idea, though, is an interesting one. And he does employ the notion of being a detective to solve the problems of knowledge.
That's interesting. We have gone on for longer than we want to. I hope it's like reasonable stuff, though. We shall see.
I find it interesting.
I just want to take you up on that last point, is that these detective procedures do seem to closely parallel what in philosophy would be called the abductive or retroductive empirical method, as opposed to the usual juxtaposition of deduction versus induction. Right. At the end of the day, what's important to note is I think that much of that orientation, much of that method would actually remain under realism per totum reum, or whatever you care to call it, as well as under critical realism.
I agree with that.
Because the former, the metaphysical realism also canvasses abduction or retroduction, solving the detective mystery, right, as the correct empirical method. And in many of the social sciences, including, my field of monetary macroeconomics, realism implies that the ultimate goal of research is explanation, exactly as the detective story does, rather than prediction or forecasting. Like it's a bit vain, as it were, to imagine that you can predict the future or forecast the future. But the fact that we can't know the future does by no means suggest that there cannot be sensible policy advice. This would be advice based on, quote, genuine knowledge acquired by the inductive method. So I suppose ultimately you could make the point that this critique of knowledge per se is not going to make much difference after all, right? Therefore, why bother at all with the critical tag and its idealist overtones? We end up in practice doing the same thing. Hubbard is still solving his mystery, right? And the scientists in the special sciences, I would argue, should try to operate much more like those detectives than running regressions on statistics and that kind of thing. Also, I think Gilson and other realists would make the point that in that case, and dramatically unlike modern and postmodern philosophy, we would arguably have a solid philosophical basis to place some confidence in our decisions. So is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is not an unreasonable thing, and I tend to agree with what you said earlier, which is that does this make any difference whatsoever? I mean, whether you're a critical realist,
well, in a way, I hope it does, because we just spent a long time talking about it.
We spent a long time talking about it, and it's important to kind of understand the difference. But in the end, does it really make a difference? I just want to remind you that you sometimes say something like this: that the greatest difference between an idealist, this is from Gilson, the greatest difference between an idealist and a realist is that the idealist thinks, whereas the realist knows, right? And I think that one of the things that metaphysical realism seems to push is that they have knowledge.
Not necessarily that they have knowledge, but it is possible to acquire knowledge. Right. In the case of economists, that the two-handed economist, Harry Truman famously said, "I wish you could send me a one-handed economist." Right? Back in the day, because the typical economist says, well, on the one hand, this, and on the other hand, this. Yeah. And then Truman and other presidents will say, well, I'm sorry, this is not good enough. Tell me what make a decision. You're supposed to have expertise. You're supposed to know something.
Sure.
Let me know what it is. I mean, I guess that's that.
I'm going to be the devil's advocate though, because you said that, okay, you make a fair point. The realist doesn't say that we have not, but it's possible to know. I would argue the same thing about the idealist. They also say that it's possible to know. Now, to simply say that knowledge is only possible if you're a realist, not an idealist, I think is an oversimplification between idealism and realism. And this is an unfortunate thing because philosophy is complicated. And idealism and realism is complicated.
Well, here's the thing. This is ultimately what I'm getting at. Is philosophy actually all that complicated, or do we make it complicated?
Well, okay, what I would say is that the human experience is complicated.
Yes, okay. I'm not going to disagree with anyone else.
So I would just perhaps disagree with what I gather you're implying, which is that idealists, are focused on overthinking, and that they argue that thinking is more real than experience. Mm-hmm. I don't know about that. I don't think that idealists say this. They certainly highlight the importance of thinking and ideas, but there's a nuanced kind of understanding there that we need to talk. We will talk about it later.
Well, what you see, we've gone on a long time. Thank you all for your forbearance, assuming that you've got this far with us.
Right. So I think we should probably end it here. Only because
here's the thing. Yeah. What have we got to do next time? We've got to talk about metaphysical realism again.
We're going to talk about metaphysical realism in depth.
So thank you, Ronen. Bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye. Take care.